Okay, this fourth part of the rules primer focuses on movement, but first let's look at the rules around stacking and zones of control. First, aircraft, constructed bridges, and other play aid markers don't count against stacking. Most other combat units are bound by the combat unit stacking chart on play aid 2B. Generally, up to 3 combat units per hex, and if you overstack, you must eliminate units to reduce down to 3 or less. You also can't have 2 headquarters of the same echelon level in the same hex. So you can't stack, for example, 2 divisional headquarters together, 2 headquarters together, and so forth. And if you break this, they both become disrupted, not eliminated. I mentioned in the first rules primer the rules around units from different divisions or corps stacking together. But to add to that, corps or army echelon units may stack and move to each other if using strategic movement rates. If a unit retreats through a unit it cannot legally pass through, or ends a retreat stacked with a unit it can't stack with because of command, all of those units involved are disrupted. Now, of course, if they're overstacked as a result, again, you must eliminate the excess units to reduce down to 3 or less. Now, there are various exceptions to this, which I won't go through, but it's worth paying attention to section 24, which details a few of those. When units become disrupted, you place a disrupt 1 marker on them. Now, further disruption to that unit causes this to flip to a disruption 2 marker. Any headquarters or artillery disrupted by this are flipped to their march side, and they must remain on that side until they recover. And all disrupted units have basically half movement, and they lose reserve status if they had it, and disruption is recovered at the end of turn segment. Now let's talk about zones of control. And the zones of control rule are a bit tricky in a time for Trumpets. Different units exert zones of control into different areas, and there's a chart to explain all this on play aid card 2A. Turn and weather effects such as fog, dense fog, snow and night also modify that chart. Zones of control also extend across rivers and streams, except across the Meuse. Now, to summarise what I've said about ZOCs in previous videos, ZOCs block combat paths, supply paths, and supply roads. It can't be negated by friendly combat units for tracing supply, but it may be negated for those comms paths. I spoke about this earlier. Now, ZOCs also impact movement. When a unit enters an enemy ZOC, it must stop. Units can't move directly from one ZOC of one unit to a different ZOC of the same unit, but they may move from the ZOC of one unit to the ZOC of a different enemy unit. To illustrate that, this unit here, for example, can't move from here to here, but it could move from here to the ZOC of a different unit. In any case, whenever a unit enters an enemy ZOC, it must immediately stop. Now, if a unit is forced to retreat into an enemy ZOC that affects it per the chart, then it is eliminated. And advances after combat can ignore ZOCs in the first hex of an advance. Okay, let's talk more about movement. And the first thing I want to mention is reinforcements and strategic movement. Now, reinforcements enter via the scenario order of appearance charts in the specified hexes. Headquarters enter in comms, in supply, and with a rested marker. They activate in line with other command activations. Basically, when their parent, army, corps, headquarters is activate, they activate as well, and they can come on the board. If the entry hex is blocked by enemy units or ZOCs, they can enter in a hex adjacent to enemy units, but then stop because it's a ZOC. Strategic movement can be used by newly entering reinforcements and units already on the map as specified, if specified, in scenario setup charts and scenario rules. Now, this provides a reduced cost for moving along primary and secondary roads according to the road movement chart. In addition, US infantry units move with a strategic movement allowance of 8 movement factors, and you place a truck marker to indicate this. Now, units moving with that strategic movement may not move adjacent to enemy units, and if enemy units move adjacent to them, they lose that strat move marker. But in that case, US infantry units can keep their trucks until they reach their designated assembly location as specified in the scenario rules. As I mentioned earlier, strat move also provides some exceptions for units passing through units from other formations commands, provided they don't end in those hexes. And beyond that, movement is fairly straightforward. You can move each unit up to their movement factor, keeping in mind various conditions that reduce this allowance to half and the variable terrain cost for different types of units. Now, there are also traffic jams on the 16th of December, which add additional movement costs in certain areas for certain armies. I've talked about bridges and fords, but I'll also add that foot units can cross unbridged streams or rivers other than the Mews if they start their movement adjacent to those rivers and their first move is to cross. And once they've crossed in that first move, they can continue spending their remaining movement factors. Now, I've covered headquarters and artillery movement earlier. I'll just note that some artillery, and there is one anti-tank unit that has no movement factor, and they can only move by random events. I also explored interdiction area earlier. So be mindful of moving through a strafing area and the additional costs involved. However, vehicular costs, including AFVs, truck units, cross-country units, and horse-drawn units, can attempt to avoid that penalty by using forest roads. Now, to do so, you must be able to avoid the full interdiction costs to move, and then you roll, and if you pass, you avoid those extra costs of that hex and subsequent forest hexes. If you fail, you stop in that first hex that you're moving to and become disrupted. Allied units may also engage in off-map unit. They leave the map via certain hexes, they enter certain off-map zones. They can later move to adjacent zones and then stop. They can continue doing this and later re-enter the map from those zones to designated entry hexes. Finally, part of the movement rules also include provisions for overruns. Now, headquarters can be overrun in any hex, and frontline combat, support, or arty units can be overrun in clear, woods, or broken terrain. If a moving attacking force with tanks can legally enter the defender's hex during a daylight turn with a base combat factor of 10-1. That's before any shifts are considered. In this case, the defender is temporarily placed below an overrun marker. They'll later be eliminated and the attackers move into and stop in that hex. Now, there are a few conditions that prevent overrun, and you should pay attention to section 35.2 in particular. Overrun is also possible on night turns by Kampfgruppe Piper and the 2nd SS Panzer Division and 2nd Panzer Division, with additional requirement that the attackers must also include an infantry unit. And folks, with those movement rules out of the way, the next video will explore combat.